Okay, so picture this. It's the turn of the 20th century, and in Europe's biggest cities, two brand new figures are starting to haunt the public imagination. They're young, they're surprisingly stylish, and they're seen as incredibly dangerous. They were the hooligan and the Apache. And their story, well, it shows us a pattern that repeats over and over again, how society often creates its own monsters. Right, let's jump straight in and meet our two main characters. On one side of the channel, you've got London's hooligan. Think street gangster known for sudden, pretty brutal violence. Then you hop over to Paris and you meet the Apache. He was called a dandy of the slums, and get this, he saw stealing as a kind of social restitution, not just a crime. So you have two different cities, but two surprisingly similar boogeymen of youth rebellion. So where did these guys even come from? Well, to get that, we have to look at the huge social shifts happening across Europe. The world was changing fast, and so were its young people. You see, for the very first time, a lot of working-class kids had a little bit of money in their pockets and some free time on their hands. And instead of just being invisible workers, they were suddenly visible. They were out on the streets, creating their own cultures, their own rules. And this new presence, it was a real challenge to the buttoned-up, respectable middle-class folks, the bourgeoisie. And a huge part of that challenge was how they looked. I mean, these weren't just random thugs, no. These guys had a very specific, and to many, a very shocking sense of style. There's this quote from a popular book back then that just nails the hooligan's whole vibe. It describes a young guy, Alf, who's wearing this fashionable blue handkerchief right before pulling out a practical-looking knife. And that's it right there. It's this wild mix of style and menace, a look that basically screams, yeah, I look good, but don't mess with me. Now let's go back to Paris, because we see almost the exact same attitude. The Apache wasn't just some common criminal, he was a slum dandy, and he had pride. He flat out refused to be a nobody. This need for recognition, to be a big enough deal to actually make the news, that was everything to him. So what we're really seeing here is the birth of a totally new kind of character, the dandy delinquent. Their whole look, the scarves, the belts, the shiny boots, it was as much a weapon as any knife. Style was their statement. It was a uniform of defiance, a way of carving out an identity in a world that would rather they just stayed quiet. Now, at first, these groups were really just a local thing, a neighborhood problem maybe. So how on earth did they become these huge national symbols of fear? Well, the answer, as it so often is, was the media. Two key events basically lit the fuse. First, in London, this novel, The Hooligan Nights, took the local hooligans and turned him into a kind of dark literary celebrity. Then, over in Paris, a crazy, sensational trial about two pimps fighting over a prostitute they called Goldenhead just exploded in the newspapers. The Apaches weren't really even part of it, but they got tangled up in the story and suddenly became the face of the entire Parisian underworld. The press in both cities just ran with it. They took these isolated incidents and blew them up into what looked like a nationwide crime epidemic. They took local fears and broadcast them to everyone, creating what we now call a moral panic. And the effect was huge. The names hooligan and Apache got totally disconnected from their origins. A hooligan wasn't a specific kid from a specific part of London anymore. Nope, it just became a catch-all word for any young troublemaker in Britain. Same thing happened with Apache in France. The labels went viral. Now, all this fear wasn't just good for selling newspapers. It also became an incredibly powerful tool for politicians and authorities who had their own agenda. All of a sudden, you had these law and order types declaring a punitive crisis. That was their term for it. They basically argued that youth crime was out of control, and the only way to fix it was to go back to tougher, more physical punishments. And they had a pretty clear playbook. Step 1. They demanded the return of corporal punishment. That quickly escalated to step 2. They started calling for the use of the whip on young troublemakers, or foyers as they called them in France. And finally, this fear was used to stop social progress in its tracks. The terrifying image of the Apache was actually used as a political weapon to stop France from abolishing the death penalty. So let's just be really clear about what happened. The fear of these young men was totally weaponized. It became the perfect excuse to crack down, not just on crime, but on social reform itself. It was a way to justify state repression and slam the brakes on what a lot of people in power saw as dangerously progressive ideas. When you take a step back, the story of the hooligan and the Apache isn't just some dusty piece of history. It's a textbook example, a blueprint, really, of how the media and the establishment can grab hold of a youth subculture, blow up its scariest parts, and then use that fear to control not just the kids, but everyone else too. And that brings us to the big question, doesn't it? This whole pattern of defining a group, exaggerating the threat, and using it for control, does any of that sound familiar? The names change, of course, and the media has shifted from newspapers to our social media feeds, but that basic dynamic feels pretty timeless. It really makes you wonder, who are the hooligans and the Apaches of today?